The cruelest kind of regret is the one that arrives after the door has already closed. Claire Bennett never believed in fate, but she had started believing in patterns, and the strangest pattern of all had the same pair of familiar blue eyes. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, where autumn painted the sidewalks in gold and copper, and people hurried toward office towers with steaming coffee cups warming their hands. Claire stepped out of her favorite neighborhood cafe balancing an oat milk latte and a paper bag holding a fresh blueberry muffin, expecting nothing more dramatic than another productive workday. Then she saw him. Ethan Carter stood across the street beside a black luxury SUV, one hand tucked into the pocket of his charcoal overcoat, as if he had nowhere else to be. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply watching the crosswalk, and the moment Claire noticed him, he looked away, almost like someone caught remembering instead of spying. The traffic light changed. She crossed with the crowd, and by the time she reached the opposite sidewalk, the SUV had quietly disappeared into traffic. She convinced herself it was coincidence. Chicago wasn't exactly a small town, but successful professionals often moved through the same neighborhoods, attended the same charity events, and frequented the same coffee shops. It happened. At least, that was what she told herself. 3 days later, she attended the opening of an architecture exhibit on the north side of the city. Soft jazz drifted through the gallery while conversations blended into the quiet elegance of polished concrete floors and white walls. Claire admired a scale model displayed beneath warm lights until an unexpected chill traveled across her shoulders. She turned. Ethan was there again, speaking politely with an elderly donor. Their eyes met for barely 2 seconds before he offered the slightest nod, respectful and restrained, as though acknowledging an old acquaintance instead of the woman he had once called his wife. Claire returned the nod because good manners cost nothing, then continued through the exhibit without looking back. Still, she could feel the weight of unanswered questions following her more closely than footsteps ever could. Weeks passed, and the encounters continued. A bookstore on Michigan Avenue, a fundraising luncheon, a grocery store on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Never close enough to start a conversation. Never far enough to disappear from her thoughts. Ethan never interrupted her meals, never approached her friends, never sent flowers or messages, and never invented excuses to speak. He simply appeared like an unfinished sentence that refused to leave the page. Her coworkers joked that she had acquired an invisible bodyguard. Claire laughed with them, but the laughter never reached her eyes because only she knew the history behind that familiar face. Ethan Carter had once signed a contract promising to share a home with her for exactly 2 years. He had fulfilled every obligation printed on those expensive sheets of paper, and when the agreement ended, so had their marriage. No arguments, no dramatic courtroom scene, no shattered dishes, just signatures, quiet farewells, and 2 people walking towards separate futures. That had been 1 year ago. She had accepted the ending because contracts always expired. Feelings, she believed, were supposed to expire with them. Yet now, every unexpected glimpse of Ethan quietly challenged the certainty she had worked so hard to build. Claire did not fear him. She did not hate him. What unsettled her was something far more difficult to explain. It was the expression he wore every single time their paths crossed, an expression that looked less like hope and more like someone searching for a home he had only realized he loved after he had already given away the keys. The memory arrived without warning the following morning as Claire stood before the wide windows of her apartment, watching the city wake beneath a pale gray sky. It was strange how seeing Ethan again had unlocked doors she had spent an entire year carefully closing. 3 years earlier, before the polished office towers, the quiet galleries, and the unexpected encounters, everything had begun with a conference room that felt far too large for 2 strangers. The table had been covered with neatly organized documents, legal folders, and 2 identical silver pens waiting beside the final page. There were no flowers, no family photographs, and certainly no promises whispered between hopeful hearts. Only signatures. Ethan Carter entered wearing a navy suit that fit him with effortless precision. He was already known throughout Chicago business circles as the disciplined heir to Carter Holdings, a man whose schedule left little room for personal complications. Claire Bennett had been invited because she possessed something equally valuable. She was intelligent, discreet, financially independent, and completely uninterested in chasing the Carter family fortune. The proposal sounded less like the beginning of a marriage and more like the outline of a corporate partnership. 2 years. Public appearances together. Mutual respect. Separate financial accounts. Complete freedom once the agreement expired. Neither party would expect romance, emotional commitment, or lifelong promises. Ethan reviewed each clause with calm professionalism, answering every legal question without hesitation. His voice never rose, and his expression revealed almost nothing beyond quiet confidence. Claire remembered wondering whether he approached every important decision with the same measured distance. When their attorney finally slid the contract toward her, the room became impossibly still. She understood exactly what she was accepting. It was not a fairy tale. It was not destiny. It was simply an arrangement that solved complicated problems for both of them. She signed her name anyway. Ethan offered his hand across the table. His handshake was warm, steady, and respectful. "Thank you," he said. "I believe this will work well for both of us." Claire smiled politely before replying. "So do I." Neither of them realized that those ordinary words would eventually become impossible to forget. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later inside a historic courthouse overlooking the Chicago River. Only a handful of witnesses attended. There was no orchestra, no elaborate reception, and no dramatic celebration. The ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes before everyone quietly returned to their schedules. Reporters photographed the newly married couple smiling beside the courthouse steps, creating headlines about one of the city's most eligible businessmen finally settling down. The public admired what looked like a perfect match. Only Claire and Ethan understood that perfection had been carefully negotiated long before they exchanged rings. During the drive home, silence filled the luxury sedan. Ethan glanced toward her once before speaking. "You are free to decorate the house however you like. If there is anything you need, let my assistant know." Claire looked through the window as the skyline reflected across the river. "Thank you," she answered softly. "I will try not to make your life more complicated." Ethan almost smiled. "I do not think you will." Neither of them noticed how naturally the conversation flowed despite its formality. Neither understood that comfort sometimes arrived quietly, disguised as routine instead of passion. As the gates opened to the estate that would become their shared address, Claire stepped inside carrying only 2 suitcases and a carefully guarded heart. She reminded herself once again that contracts always had expiration dates. Feelings, she believed, would never become part of the agreement. The first few months settled into a rhythm so quiet that it almost felt natural. Every weekday began with the sound of the coffee grinder echoing through the spacious kitchen just after 6:30 in the morning. Claire discovered that Ethan always left for the office by 7:30, never skipped breakfast, and preferred black coffee with nothing added. He had never told her those details. She simply noticed them the way thoughtful people notice the small habits that make up another person's life. She never announced that breakfast was ready or reminded him to eat. She simply placed a warm plate beneath the soft lights of the dining room before he came downstairs. Sometimes it was scrambled eggs with sourdough toast. Sometimes it was fresh fruit with yogurt and homemade granola. Other mornings it was oatmeal with cinnamon during the cold Chicago winters. Ethan rarely commented beyond a quiet thank you before opening his tablet to review reports from Carter Holdings. Claire told herself that appreciation did not always need grand words. She accepted those brief moments as enough. Their evenings followed a similar pattern. Ethan often returned home long after sunset, his shoulders carrying the invisible weight of meetings, negotiations, and responsibilities that never seemed to end. Claire never asked about confidential business matters. Instead, she would quietly leave a hot dinner warming in the oven and a single lamp glowing in the living room, making the enormous house feel less empty when he walked through the front door. Sometimes she was still reading on the couch. Other nights, she had already gone upstairs, leaving behind only a handwritten note reminding him not to forget dessert in the refrigerator. Ethan always smiled at those notes, although he never realized he had begun keeping them folded inside the drawer of his nightstand instead of throwing them away. On weekends, they occasionally attended charity galas or corporate events where photographers admired their effortless elegance. Ethan would offer his arm before entering every ballroom, and Claire accepted with graceful confidence. They smiled for cameras, exchanged polite conversations with donors, and looked exactly like a couple deeply in love. Guests often whispered how perfectly suited they seemed together. Neither of them corrected those assumptions. Once the evening ended and the limousine carried them home beneath the glowing city skyline, silence usually returned. Yet it was no longer uncomfortable. It had become familiar, almost comforting. Claire slowly realized that she had stopped thinking of the mansion as temporary. She found herself choosing fresh flowers for the entryway every Friday afternoon, replacing old bookshelves with ones that suited Ethan's growing collection of biographies, and planting white roses beside the back patio, because she noticed he always paused there before leaving for work. He never asked who had arranged those thoughtful details. He simply accepted them as though the house had always possessed that quiet warmth. Claire never expected recognition. Loving someone, she believed, often looked ordinary from the outside. It was remembering appointments without reminders, noticing when someone looked exhausted before they admitted it, replacing a burned-out porch light before they came home after dark, or leaving an umbrella by the front door because rain had been predicted for the afternoon. Ethan saw every improvement individually, but never connected them to the woman quietly transforming a residence into a home. He assumed comfort simply happened. He never questioned why the house always felt peaceful after difficult days or why returning there gradually became the favorite part of his schedule. Claire noticed the change before he did. She saw how he lingered a little longer over breakfast, how his shoulders relaxed the moment he crossed the front door, and how he sometimes looked toward the kitchen before saying goodnight, almost expecting to find her there. Without realizing it, both of them had already stepped beyond the careful boundaries written inside a legal contract. Only one of them understood that invisible line had been crossed. Time has an unusual way of honoring promises even when hearts quietly break beneath them. The second anniversary of their marriage arrived on a bright spring morning with clear skies stretching above Chicago, and Claire woke before sunrise knowing exactly what day it was. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments echoed through the house. No painful accusations filled the silence. The date simply existed, calm and undeniable, like the final page of a book that had been waiting patiently to be turned. Ethan left for an early board meeting after thanking her for breakfast, completely unaware that every ordinary moment carried the weight of an ending Claire had been preparing herself to face for months. After the front door closed behind him, she walked slowly through every room of the house. Her fingertips brushed the polished piano that neither of them had learned to play. She straightened the stack of business magazines on the coffee table. She watered the white roses blooming outside the kitchen window. Each familiar detail reminded her that a place could feel like home even when it had never truly belonged to her. By noon she had packed only what she had brought with her 2 years earlier. 2 suitcases, a few books, family photographs, her favorite coffee mug with a tiny crack near the handle. She deliberately left behind everything Ethan had purchased for her during the marriage because none of it had ever been the reason she stayed. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned earlier than expected. He found Claire sitting in the library beside the large window where soft sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. A neatly organized folder rested on the table between them. He recognized it immediately. The contract. Without speaking, Claire slid the documents toward him. Every required signature had already been completed. Ethan opened the folder, quietly reviewing the final pages as though he were closing another successful business agreement. His expression remained composed, almost unreadable. After a long silence, he looked up and said, "Everything appears to be in order." Claire answered with the same gentle smile she had worn on the day they first met in that conference room. "I wanted the process to be simple." Ethan nodded once. "Thank you for honoring the agreement." The words landed softly, yet somehow they felt heavier than either of them expected. Claire stood and removed the wedding ring from her finger. She placed it carefully beside the signed contract instead of handing it directly to him. There was no bitterness in the gesture, only acceptance. Ethan looked at the ring for several quiet seconds before slipping it into the folder and closing it. He walked with her to the front entrance where her suitcases already waited beside the door. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the neighborhood. Claire turned toward him one last time. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." He answered automatically, almost out of habit. "You too, Claire." Neither of them stepped forward. Neither reached for one final embrace. There was nothing left that either believed needed to be said. Claire climbed into a waiting rideshare. and as the car disappeared beyond the gates, Ethan remained standing on the front porch with one hand resting in his coat pocket. He watched until the vehicle vanished from sight before returning inside the house. The silence greeted him exactly as it always had, yet something invisible had changed. The dining table was perfectly set for one instead of two. The lamp in the living room remained switched off. The faint scent of fresh flowers had already begun to fade. For the first time since the contract had been signed, the mansion no longer felt comfortably quiet. It simply felt empty, and Ethan could not explain why. The emptiness did not announce itself all at once. It settled into Ethan Carter's life the way winter quietly covered the streets of Chicago, one silent layer at a time, until everything familiar looked different. The first Monday after Claire left, he followed the same routine he had repeated for 2 years. He walked downstairs at 7:15, expecting the aroma of freshly brewed coffee to greet him before he reached the kitchen. Instead, the room was perfectly clean, perfectly organized, and completely still. His assistant had arranged for breakfast to be delivered, exactly as instructed, but the neatly packaged meal waiting on the counter felt strangely impersonal. He opened the container, stared at it for several seconds, then quietly closed it again. He picked up a travel coffee from a cafe on his way to the office, but after one sip, he realized it did not taste like the coffee he had grown accustomed to every morning. He dismissed the thought as unimportant. People adjusted. That was what adults did. Days became weeks, and the quiet inconveniences multiplied in ways Ethan never expected. A favorite navy tie was no longer hanging exactly where he instinctively reached for it. His dry cleaning arrived, but no one had separated the shirts he preferred for board meetings. Important documents remained where his staff placed them instead of appearing neatly organized on his desk before he asked. None of these things were significant on their own, yet together they formed an absence too consistent to ignore. One rainy Thursday evening, he returned home after a 12-hour negotiation feeling more exhausted than usual. He loosened his tie while walking through the front hallway, expecting the warm glow of the living room lamp that had welcomed him every evening for 2 years. Darkness waited instead. He switched on the lights himself and stood in the silence longer than necessary. The house had not become larger. It only felt that way. The following weekend, he wandered through the property with no destination in mind. The white roses behind the patio were blooming beautifully, healthier than ever, but he realized he had absolutely no idea how to care for them. Claire had always handled that without mentioning it. He reached down and gently brushed one of the blossoms with his fingertips, remembering how she used to smile whenever the first flowers opened each spring. The memory appeared so naturally that it caught him off guard. Later that afternoon, he opened a kitchen cabinet searching for a coffee mug and discovered the small collection Claire had chosen during their marriage. Most remained untouched, but one space on the shelf was empty. Her favorite mug with the tiny crack near the handle had gone with her. For reasons he could not explain, that empty space unsettled him more than the expensive artwork missing from the walls ever could have. His housekeeper eventually asked whether he wished to redecorate now that he was living alone. Ethan looked around the elegant dining room before quietly answering, "No. Leave everything exactly as it is." She nodded without understanding that nothing inside the house actually looked wrong. The problem was that everything looked exactly the same while feeling completely different. One evening, unable to sleep, Ethan opened the drawer of his nightstand searching for a misplaced charger. Beneath a stack of documents, he found several folded notes written in Claire's unmistakable handwriting. "Do not forget your umbrella. Dinner is in the oven. Good luck with your presentation today. Drive safely because the roads are icy." He unfolded each one carefully, reading words that had once seemed so ordinary. For the first time since the divorce papers had been signed, he understood something that every contract in the world had failed to explain. Claire had never simply lived in his house. She had quietly woven herself into the ordinary moments of his life so completely that he had mistaken her presence for routine. And only after she was gone did Ethan begin to understand that the things he missed the most had never been the grand gestures. They were the countless small kindnesses he had accepted every day without ever realizing they were expressions of love. By the time summer returned to Chicago, Claire Bennett had built a life that no longer revolved around memories. Her apartment overlooked a quieter neighborhood where the mornings began with sunlight spilling across hardwood floors instead of the echo of footsteps inside a mansion that had never truly belonged to her. She no longer woke according to someone else's schedule. She brewed her own coffee exactly the way she liked it, added fresh flowers to the dining table simply because they made her smile, and spent the early hours reading industry reports before walking the half-mile to the design firm where she had recently been promoted to creative director. The promotion had surprised no one except Claire herself. During the years of her marriage, she had quietly placed parts of her own ambition on hold, never because Ethan had asked her to, but because she had unconsciously centered her routines around another person's life. Now those hours belonged entirely to her again. Her colleagues noticed the difference immediately. She laughed more easily. She spoke with quiet confidence during presentations. Clients trusted her calm judgment, and projects that once felt intimidating gradually became opportunities she accepted without hesitation. Success did not transform her personality. It simply revealed the woman she had always been beneath years of careful restraint. Friends occasionally suggested that she begin dating again. Claire always answered with the same gentle smile before changing the subject. She was not waiting for Ethan. She simply refused to treat loneliness like an emergency that needed solving. For the first time in years, her life felt complete even without someone standing beside her. On Saturday mornings, she wandered through local farmers markets carrying a woven tote bag filled with fresh bread, seasonal fruit, and wildflowers. On Sunday afternoons, she visited museums or spent hours sketching ideas beside the lake while sailboats drifted across the water beneath bright blue skies. There was a peaceful rhythm to her days that could not be purchased or negotiated. It had been earned through acceptance. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself learning about Claire's new life through accidental conversations rather than deliberate searches. During a business luncheon, one executive casually mentioned a remarkable presentation delivered by a talented designer named Claire Bennett. Another evening, while attending a charity fundraiser, Ethan noticed several respected entrepreneurs greeting her with genuine admiration instead of polite curiosity. She moved through crowded rooms with quiet confidence, no longer standing beside anyone else's reputation. She had become one of her own. Ethan remained several steps away, watching without interrupting. He noticed how naturally she smiled now, how relaxed her posture had become, and how effortlessly she connected with people around her. There was no performance in her kindness. No attempt to prove that she was happier without him. She simply was. That realization unsettled him more deeply than anger ever could have. If Claire had spent the past year trying to make him jealous, he might have understood it. If she had confronted him with accusations, perhaps he could have defended himself. Instead, she had done something far more powerful. She had quietly built a meaningful life that no longer required his presence. Ethan suddenly recognized an uncomfortable truth. He had always believed the contract had protected both of them from emotional complications. Instead, it had protected him from recognizing what he already had until it quietly slipped beyond his reach. Standing across the ballroom, while Claire laughed warmly at something a colleague had said, Ethan realized she no longer looked like someone carrying an unfinished chapter. She looked like someone who had already turned the page. For the first time since she walked out of his front door with only 2 suitcases, he understood that time had not been waiting for him to catch up. It had been gently carrying Claire forward, and with every step she took away from the life they once shared, she became someone he admired even more deeply than the woman he had failed to truly see. Autumn returned once again, bringing crisp air and amber leaves that drifted across the sidewalks of downtown Chicago. And with every passing week, Ethan found himself crossing paths with Claire more often than chance alone could reasonably explain. It was never planned aloud, at least not in any way he would admit, even to himself. When he received an invitation to a design symposium hosted by several of the city's largest developers, he noticed Claire's company listed among the featured presenters. He attended without hesitation, telling his executive assistant that it would be valuable for future partnerships. Sitting quietly in the audience, he watched Claire step onto the stage with effortless confidence. She spoke clearly, answered difficult questions with calm intelligence, and smiled with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer questioned her own worth. When the presentation ended, dozens of professionals surrounded her with congratulations. Ethan remained where he was until the crowd slowly dispersed. Only then did he approach. Claire noticed him immediately and greeted him with the same polite warmth she would have offered any former acquaintance. Good afternoon, Ethan. It is nice to see you. There was no hesitation, no bitterness, and no hidden emotion in her voice. Ethan returned the greeting with an equally careful smile. Congratulations. Your presentation was impressive. Claire thanked him sincerely before another colleague called her name from across the room. She excused herself with perfect courtesy, wished him a pleasant afternoon, and walked away without looking back. The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet Ethan remained standing in the same place long after she disappeared into the crowd. He realized something that unsettled him deeply. During their marriage, she had always been emotionally close even when they spoke very little. Now she was perfectly kind while standing farther away than ever before. Several weeks later, they encountered each other again inside a bookstore on Michigan Avenue. Claire was browsing the architecture section with a small basket tucked beneath her arm. Ethan noticed the familiar habit of gently running her fingertips across book spines before choosing one. It was something she had always done, although he had never truly paid attention until now. Their eyes met between the tall wooden shelves. Claire smiled. Looking for something interesting? She asked. Ethan glanced at the biography in his hands before answering honestly. I suppose I am. They exchanged a few casual remarks about books, the changing weather, and a recently restored historic building downtown. The conversation flowed naturally, almost comfortably, until Claire checked the time on her watch. I should go, she said. I promised to meet a friend for dinner. Ethan nodded, stepping aside so she could pass. Have a wonderful evening. You too. Claire replied before disappearing through the front entrance as the small bell above the door softly chimed behind her. Ethan remained inside the bookstore holding the same unread biography, realizing he had forgotten why he came there in the first place. Similar moments continued throughout the following months. A charity gala, a community fundraiser, a holiday concert beneath thousands of white lights. Every encounter followed the same quiet pattern. Claire always greeted him warmly. She listened respectfully. She smiled sincerely. Then she continued living her life. She never lingered in conversations that had naturally reached their end. She never searched his face for old feelings. She never hinted that the past deserved another chance. Ethan slowly understood that distance was not always created by coldness. Sometimes it was created by peace. Claire no longer carried unfinished questions inside her heart because she had already accepted every answer she needed. Standing alone after another brief conversation faded into the noise of an elegant ballroom, Ethan realized that regret did not become lighter through repeated meetings. Each polite smile she offered reminded him that she had forgiven the past without returning to it, and somehow that quiet grace hurt far more than anger ever could. Winter settled over Chicago with quiet elegance, covering rooftops with a thin layer of snow that softened even the busiest streets. And one December evening, Ethan accepted an invitation to the annual Carter Foundation Holiday Gala, not because he enjoyed formal events anymore, but because declining would have created more questions than attending. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the ballroom, while a string quartet filled the room with gentle melodies. Guests moved gracefully from one conversation to another, celebrating another successful year of charitable work. Ethan greeted familiar faces automatically, yet his attention wandered until he noticed Claire standing near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. She wore a simple midnight blue gown that reflected the winter lights without demanding attention, speaking with several architects and nonprofit directors who listened with genuine admiration. There was nothing dramatic about her presence. She did not command the room by trying to be noticed. She simply belonged wherever she stood. Ethan considered walking toward her, but stopped when an older woman approached him first. It was Margaret Sullivan, the retired chairwoman of the foundation and one of the few people who had known both Ethan and Claire throughout their marriage. She smiled kindly before saying, "She looks happy." Ethan followed her gaze without pretending not to know whom she meant. "She does," he answered quietly. Margaret remained silent for a moment before adding, "Do you know something I never understood?" Ethan turned toward her. "What is that?" She smiled gently. Claire agreed to a contract marriage, but she never lived like it was a contract. Ethan frowned slightly, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. Margaret continued, her voice calm and thoughtful. "I remember the first charity dinner after your wedding. Everyone assumed she was simply fulfilling public obligations. I watched her instead. She noticed when your mother became tired before anyone else did. She quietly rearranged the seating because she knew one donor had difficulty hearing from his left ear. She memorized the names of employees no one else greeted personally. None of those things were required by any agreement. They came from her heart. Ethan remained perfectly still. Margaret looked at him with the compassion that only age sometimes teaches. I asked her once why she worked so hard for a marriage that everyone knew had an expiration date. Ethan felt his pulse quicken almost imperceptibly. What did she say? Margaret's expression softened even further. She smiled and said that a contract might explain how two people meet, but it could never decide how sincerely someone chooses to care. The words settled heavily inside Ethan as if every ordinary memory from the past 2 years had suddenly found its missing meaning. Breakfast waiting every morning. Notes folded beside his briefcase. White roses blooming behind the house. Warm lights left on after late meetings. She had never been completing obligations. She had been loving him in the quiet language of everyday life. He had mistaken devotion for routine because it had arrived without demands or conditions. Across the ballroom, Claire laughed softly at something one of her colleagues had said, completely unaware that another piece of the past had finally fallen into place. Ethan watched her with eyes no longer clouded by misunderstanding. For the first time, he understood that he had never been the only one treating their marriage like a business arrangement. Claire had entered with legal documents in her hands, but somewhere along the way she had quietly set them aside and offered something infinitely more valuable. She had given him a real heart inside an unreal agreement, and the greatest tragedy was not that she had loved him. It was that he had only learned the truth after she had already found the strength to let that love become a beautiful memory instead of a lifelong hope. A few weeks after the holiday gala, the first signs of spring began pushing through the last patches of snow, and Chicago slowly exchanged gray skies for pale blue mornings. Claire left her office one Friday evening carrying a leather portfolio and a small bouquet of tulips she had purchased from a street vendor on the walk home. As she reached the quiet river walk, she noticed someone standing near the railing, watching the water flow beneath the bridges. Ethan did not seem surprised when she approached. Instead, he offered the same respectful nod he had given her during every unexpected meeting over the past year. "Good evening, Claire." She smiled gently. "Good evening, Ethan." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them with its familiar rhythm of passing trains, distant conversations, and footsteps echoing along the pavement. Ethan finally broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" Claire answered with calm sincerity. "Of course." He looked toward the river before quietly saying, "When we signed that contract, did you ever believe it could become something real?" Claire remained silent for several seconds, not because she was searching for an answer, but because she had already made peace with it long ago. She looked across the water where the evening sun reflected in soft waves. "At first, no," she admitted. "I accepted exactly what we agreed to." Ethan listened without interrupting. Claire continued with the same gentle honesty that had always defined her. "But people are not contracts. We change while we are living." Somewhere between ordinary mornings and quiet evenings, I stopped counting how much time remained. I simply enjoyed the life we were building. Ethan lowered his eyes. "Why did you never tell me?" Claire smiled, not sadly, but with quiet understanding. "Because love is not something that should be negotiated. I knew what you believed our marriage was. I respected that." Ethan drew a slow breath that felt heavier than any boardroom decision he had ever faced. "I was wrong." Claire nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes." There was no anger in her agreement. Only truth. Ethan finally looked directly at her. "I loved you. I just realized it too late." The confession hung gently between them, carried away almost immediately by the cool breeze drifting across the river. Claire did not appear shocked. Somehow she had always suspected those words might eventually arrive. She simply wished they had arrived while there had still been a future waiting for them. She stepped a little closer, her expression warm and compassionate. "Thank you for telling me." Ethan searched her face, perhaps hoping to find even the smallest invitation to begin again. Instead, he found something quieter. "Peace." Claire continued softly. "There was a time when hearing those words would have meant everything to me. But life kept moving, and eventually I moved with it." Ethan closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. For the first time since their paths had begun crossing after the divorce, he understood that regret could explain the past, but could not rewrite it. Claire adjusted the flowers in her arm and smiled one last time. What we shared was real to me, Ethan. I will always be grateful for the good parts. They helped shape the person I became. She wished him well, turned toward the city lights, and continued walking without hesitation. Ethan remained beside the river until she disappeared into the evening crowd, not because he expected her to return, but because he wanted to remember the final image exactly as it was. She had not walked away with bitterness. She had walked away with dignity. And as the last light of day settled over the water, Ethan finally understood the lesson that had taken him years to learn. Some people do not lose the love of their life because they were never loved. They lose them because they recognize that love only after it has already become someone else's beautiful past, while the person they once overlooked has quietly become the strongest, happiest version of themselves.